Welcome to this episode of Resisting the Dragon's Beast. I am Pastor Michael Zarling. I am here with Pastor Peter Hagen. And Peter, it seems like I haven't seen you all summer.
That's probably the case. I don't think it's. I think it's been all summer since we've talked.
We have communicated, but we haven't done one of these for a while because I don't know about you, but I have been really busy. And
Yeah.
one of the things that we did was our vacation. So what was your vacation? Where'd you go and how was it?
We took a road trip down to Florida, and it was great. I got to see and go to church at church with the guy who had been my supervising pastor. So I was down in like South Florida, and then on the way back up, we stayed in North Carolina for a while. Did some hiking, saw a bear, saw some wild pigs, and saw Professor Zell. Now he's just Pastor Zell, but that was in Asheville, North Carolina. And
the bear didn't attack you, did it?
No. He it was just a little guy came wandering through where we were staying, a little Airbnb, and sniffed around to see what he could find, and didn't find anything.
The reason I ask is I read a news story yesterday about a dad and his son, and the son was, he looked to be in his late 20s, early 30s, and they were hiking, and a bear came out of nowhere and attacked the young guy and landed on him. And as he was coming at him, the young guy said he was able to reach into his holster and pull out his revolver and shoot the bear. He said he shot himself in the thigh once and maybe twice, but he said that could be a bullet hole or it could be the bear tooth. And then he said he felt the bear just die on top of him. And it was a big bear. I'm sitting at a regular white table, and the bear looked to be the size of the table.
Wow.
So don't be messing around with bears.
Yeah, definitely. What'd you do this summer besides bicycle everywhere?
I didn't. I've had a lot of issues with bikes, so my bike tires keep getting flat, and so I have to take it in to get fixed. So
you should bring it here to Toledo. We've got a fantastic bike shop here in Toledo.
Yeah, we went on vacation down to Dolphin Island, and I preached while we were down there in Mobile, and I said Dolphin Island, and the members graciously told my family, please tell Pastor it's Dolphin Island. If he says Dolphin Island, the people will just make fun of him. But the adventure started on the way south. That about 5 hours in, around midnight, we lost the two kayaks on top of our SUV on the interstate.
Oh no.
So thankfully I was able to pull off. I ran back to them and I pulled them off the interstate a second before a vehicle went whizzing by. Never saw them in the freeway. And then we had to drive 45 minutes north, the opposite direction of where we were going. I was able to find a Wells pastor that we could drop them off because there's just no Wells churches in the middle of Illinois, and those that are around don't want to answer their phone at midnight for some reason. But yeah, so there was, and it was my own fault because when I strapped him onto the roof of the vehicle, I didn't slap the back and say, well, that's not going anywhere.
Are you even a dad? Come on.
Yeah, and then later that drive, we got stopped in 2 hours of traffic because a semi carrying a fuel decided to hit another semi, and so it was on fire. And when we went by, you could see the second semi. It was potatoes, but now there were baked potatoes because of the fire. And then when we were trying to leave the island, there was a very serious car accident that closed the bridge, the only bridge on and off the island. So we were stuck there for another couple of hours. And thankfully, my wife and my oldest daughter especially love the beach. So they're going, oh, shoot, we're stuck on the beach for full 8 hours.
Yeah, what are we going to do? I don't know.
Yeah, it was miserable. Yeah, but
that sounds very adventurous.
Oh, yes. And what was interesting too is, my wife and family know that I want to be working on the second book, and they said, well, Shelley said, Michael, maybe your next book should be about our family vacations. And I said, yeah, the mostly true stories of the Zarling family treks, and just embellish a little bit, but yeah.
Hey.
And so we have been very busy, and that's why we haven't gotten to these podcasts. But I finally started working on the book, and that's why the background, if you're watching on YouTube, the background is a colorized version of a woodcut from Luther's time, and it's of the seven-headed beast, the one we see in Revelation 13, that's in chapter 2 of my book, Resisting the Dragon's Beast. That's the beast it's talking about. But now in Revelation 17, Jesus giving the revelation to St. John pictures the pagan churches as a woman, a prostitute named Babylon. And so the topic of the next book is going to be about how our U.S. government, the beast, how it partners with and even promotes and subsidizes with our tax dollars these pagan religions from the Old Testament and so on. So that's why the background is the way it is. If you're listening to the podcast, just have to imagine it. All right. Before we get into Revelation 17, two other things happened just before we got to recording this. One is I was pleasantly surprised that a congregation nearby here asked me to create a video promo for the book. That the pastor at first was very hesitant to allow the book, and I use the word allow on purpose, to allow the book. It was only going to be in people's homes. They could do it as a book study, but not in the church. And then he read the book and he said, oh, okay, well, maybe we can do it as a Bible study. And then he even asked me to do a 60 to 90 second video promotion to promote the book. So that 90-second one is on the YouTube video, and I encourage any of our listeners to go ahead and use it, share it, get their own churches to do it. I also created a 2-minute one. It's almost the same thing with just a little bit more added in, and I'll be publishing that pretty soon too. But I encourage everyone to make use of that. And then, Peter, I also wanted to get your input on this, because you must have been very busy this week, because I was surprised you did not weigh in on this. So there was the same question worded differently, one by a layperson on a Wells discussions group, and it was about like pastors and politics. Should pastors be talking about politics? And then the other one was on the Wells pastors Facebook site called Seelsorger, and it was basically kind of the same thing. What should pastors do with Republicans and Democrats and so forth? So this is what I finally wrote to weigh in, and I shared the same thing on both sites. Andrew Breitbart rightly theorized, quote, politics is downstream from culture, end quote. I think we can rightly surmise that culture is always downstream from theology. We don't need to be political, but we need to be theological. Any issue in the political realm is cultural. Because it becomes cultural, before it becomes cultural, it is theological. These political and theological issues cannot be solved by us, but we can preach Christ and his word to the issues and let the Holy Spirit solve them. We can address any political and cultural issues with law and gospel to get at the root causes. We apply God's fourth commandment and the corresponding Bible verses to building up the homes within our communities. We apply God's fifth commandment and the corresponding Bible verses to life issues. We apply God's sixth commandment and the corresponding Bible verses to issues of sex, gender dysphoria, homosexuality, marriage, and divorce. We apply God's seventh, ninth, and 10th commandments to issues involving taxes, the deficit, and the economy. We apply God's first three commandments to issues involving the pagan worship of self, sex, and climate. We do ourselves, our neighbors, and our nation a disservice when we cede these issues only to the government. Then the issues become political. but they are first moral and theological issues that Christians should be discussing, debating, and deciding. As pastors, we don't need to frame things as right versus left, but rather godly versus demonic. St. Paul correctly determined, our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the world rulers of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. So what do you think?
That was, I just found it here and I pulled it up to read along with you. Well said. And I didn't weigh in because so many other guys, covered the topic, and I was doing other things. Of course, I think that was the bigger thing. But I think it walks backward a little bit. And somebody else said this a little bit later on, that in a sense, politics is its own religion in this country, and we worship at the altar of the television and whatever we're told to be afraid of, or whatever we are told to be uncertain about, or to do to be outraged about. There's the word. And understanding that politics is a religion, that the Christian heart doesn't want to set our hearts on politics, but we need to be involved with these issues. And I thought you parsed that out very well to say, you know what, it is a theological, moral issue before it even becomes a cultural issue, before it even becomes a political issue. And I think Wade Johnson said this a number of years ago in a podcast where he was talking about vocation, and he basically said that morals are our moral beliefs, the beliefs that we hold, and the way that we see right and wrong. And then layered on top of that is ethics. How do your morals play out in everyday life? And then beyond that, you get to politics. You get to how do these things take place legally and within a community. And so if we just dismiss it all as, well, I don't want to offend anybody because I don't want to talk politics, that is missing the boat entirely. Or we want to say, the question was talking about, can a Christian vote for person A or person B and still call themselves a Bible-believing Christian? Which is a very reductionist and rather silly argument, but at least it got the ball rolling on the discussion. And I thought you brought out the main point, basically, that if we are so concerned about our politics, then we're already worshiping at the foot of the beast. and if we aren't able to articulate what we believe morally and ethically, then what theology do we have? If we just write it off and say, well, you can't be a Christian if you are red or blue or purple, or you vote as a Democrat, Republican, or Libertarian, or whatever. And I think I like the way you put it, because if I keep talking, I'll just repeat myself a lot.
Yeah, thanks. And I like what you said too about the beast. Is I think if we as pastors are afraid to talk about these kinds of issues, then the beast, then the government already has control over what we're saying. And that's exactly what Revelation chapter 13, and then what we'll be studying in the next podcast of chapters 17, and 18 of Revelation, they also say that. The beast is trying to put its foot down on the neck of the Christian church, the true bride of Christ, not the prostitute. And we're allowing it to do that when we silence ourselves. And that's why I liked how I phrased it at the end, and this was something I added on because one of our followers, the book, he had commented on the Resisting the Dragon's Beast, something I had posted, and then I took what he wrote, and that's where I said, I think too often we as pastors, and people too, we're framing things as right versus left. We need to be framing things as godly versus demonic.
And I think together with that,
as we're recording this,
together with that, a lot of the discussions, especially when you talk about right versus left, and you see this a lot from the left, with the Democratic National Convention that just finished up, and other discussions online where they're like, you've heard people say, Well, if you're a Christian, your Christian Bible talks about welcoming the foreigner and taking care of them, and watching out for the poor and the widowed and the orphaned, and watching out for those who are downtrodden in society, and building a just society. That there's been a lot of discussion, a lot of people talking about their political platform, and the right does this too, talking about their political platform as fulfillment of biblical mandate, as fulfillment of biblical command, that Jesus says, love your neighbor. And so both left and right are like, we're just both trying to love our neighbor, just we have different approaches to it. And it misses the boat entirely, because if it happens in society, if it's a solution that is given to us by the government, or by the governing authorities, then that is predicated on the law. That and it's not gospel motivated at all. It doesn't come from a heart of faith. It's not a fruit of faith. This came up the first time I encountered it was like my first year being a pastor, and we were at this big, beautiful stone church, big Gothic church. Shout out to St. Paul, Ottawa. That was right next to the University of Ottawa. Yeah, fantastic. They're having a 150th anniversary in November. Cool place, right? And every so often we would get students who come over from the university to see what this church is all about. It's still here, and they're actually worshiping in it, right? And one of the students came over and talked with my associate at the time. He was the senior pastor because I was the new guy, and he said basically, well, Acts, the book of Acts, when it says that the believers had everything in common, they sold some of their property to provide for each other. He's basically describing communism. And my associate, took the time and parsed it out with him that communism is predicated on power, and it's an exercise of power and law in order to take and then redistribute. And on the surface, in an idealized view of communism, in a place where it works, if it ever does, but in a place where it works, then it might look very similar even to what the Christian church looked like. But the Christian church and its sharing among them is fundamentally different, because it was prompted by the gospel, because it was a fruit of faith. And in that regard, even if it looked like the same outcome, it could never be the same. And so you've got both platforms, left and right and everywhere in between, trying to take advantage of ill-informed Christians and say we are fulfilling the biblical mandate of fill in the blank, caring for the poor and the widowed, caring for the unborn, making a godly nation. We're fulfilling this biblical mandate, and they're missing the point entirely because they are denying the gospel. And Christians, we get riled up about this, about who we're voting for, as if that is going to make a difference in our lives. It might, but in the grand scheme of things, not really.
Yeah. One of the things that I added later on to one of the things I added to both of those sites later on in the discussion was that politics. I said that the politics is the application of sanctification, and so if we as pastors are preaching God's word to the people, they want to know how to apply that word, and the way they do that is politics. And when we're talking about framing things as right versus left, but what we should be doing is godly versus demonic. As we're recording this right now, the Democratic National Committee is they're finishing up their convention in Chicago, and right outside of the DNC is Planned Parenthood with their mobile bus, where they're giving away free vasectomies and free abortion pills. That is something that I think we can definitely preach about and say that's demonic. Okay, that is wrong. But then, as I heard on another pastor on Issues, etc., Missouri Synod site, they were commenting about this, and the pastor rightly said, "Yeah, but the Republican committee, they're just going to be right behind this, because it'll only be a few more years before Planned Parenthood is outside of the RNC." Because again, if you're paying attention to these things, when President Trump came out with his policies, I think a week or so ago, it's really Bill Clinton's policies from the 90s. Okay. And so you might, as conservative Christians, you might say, well, we line up more with the Republican Party right now. And yet the Republican Party is really the Democratic Party from 3 decades ago. And who knows where the Republican Party is going to be 3 decades in the future. So that's why it's not good for us to preach about right versus left. We need to be saying this is what's godly, and then this is what is opposite of godly, what is from the devil.
Yeah, definitely. Because so much of the political conversation is just a narrow slice of the options. It's a window that has been reduced to just a narrow slice of the options, I guess. Instead of an actual discussion of right versus wrong, then we just get, well, we're going to limit abortion to this, or you have to choose according to your own state, instead of the full view of, you sound like an extremist if you say, well, I believe that marriage is for one man, one woman, that marriage is for life, and that they ought to raise their children by teaching them scripture, if which is theologically and doctrinally exactly what we believe. But if you say that, and if it comes up politically, then you just sound like an extremist, because that sort of discussion isn't even part of the political dialogue, I would say.
Yeah, and again, the reason we talk about these things is things like abortion, transgenderism, and so forth. They have become political, but they're not. They are theological. And again, as pastors, and my people, they expect me to talk about these things, not so much from the pulpit, but I'm not afraid to bring them up in Bible study, because, say, when it comes to abortion, you have the Democratic Committee. They are all in. It's no longer safe, legal, and rare. It is all in to the moment of birth and even after birth. But then you can, as Christians, we should find fault with the Republican National Committee of saying where Trump and J.D. Vance don't want to talk about abortion too much. And so they're saying, well, like you said, state rights, or, they have exemptions, or after 6 weeks and so forth. But as Christians, we're going to be absolutists, the moment of conception. And the same thing with transgenderism. The Democratic Committee, Biden, now Harris, they're all in on if it was possible to get trans the adults and the children, whereas President Trump just said recently, well, that he would make it illegal that any children be change their sex unless they had parental permission. No, as Christians, we should say, no, that's wrong. That's child mutilation. Whether the child has the parents' permission or not, the parents. It's even worse if a parent is for the abuse of their child. But see, if you frame it as right versus left, someone's going to get upset. But if you say those policies in both parties, whether it's abortion and transgenderism, is demonic, now we have freedom to be talking about these things.
Definitely. All right. Cool.
So just wanted to bring those kinds of things up, as to know that even though Peter and I haven't had a podcast in a while, we're still paying attention to what's going on in the world. So Peter, you and I, with these podcasts, we're going to be working on the sequel to Resisting the Dragon's Beast. And so this is a title, it's just a working title of Babylon and the Beast, How Christ Restrains the Promotion of Politics with Paganism. So I like the alliteration of Babylon and Beast, promotion, politics, paganism. And then I wanted to get a word in there, like the first book was about resisting. Now this one is about restraining and Christ restraining. And Peter and I haven't talked about this too much, so I don't know how we're going to do this. I've never co-authored a book, because I've only authored one book, and then Peter edited it. I don't know. Do you have any idea how to co-author a book?
No.
I know it's done. Lincoln and Douglas, they're some of my favorite writers, and they co-author books. So what I'm thinking is that as we go through some of these later on, as we look at the pagan religions, I'll probably write a few chapters, and then you write a few chapters, and then I'll rewrite your chapters to make them readable for normal people. And then you can, because you're like
I'll
my
edit out the
associate.
Star Wars references.
No, I just mean that not that kind of stuff. It's just you, like my associate, and a lot of other pastors. You're just a lot smarter than me and normal people, and so.
I don't know about that. Oh boy.
Yeah. All right. So let's get into Revelation 17. And what we're going to be talking about with this book is, like I mentioned earlier, the connection between current and ancient pagan religions. I mean, there is a neo-paganism around right now. And for part of the research, what I'm doing is I'm trying to listen to different podcasts while I'm working or driving and so forth, and then typing notes down like I did with the first book. But there's not a whole lot on paganism and Christianity. Now, I did find out if I wanted to listen to podcasts on just paganism, there's a whole bunch of atheistic paganism out there that I don't want to listen to. But I do want to listen to podcasts or read books, listen to books. So if our listeners have any ideas of other materials that Peter and I can research on this, that would be fantastic. So the idea is that the beast out of the sea, the government, and the pagan church, the prostitute, Babylon, that they are partnering together, that they share one purpose. Revelation 17 verse 13 says, so they together wage war against the Lamb, Jesus Christ, and his lambs, us. So for listeners, if you want to pause and then go get your Bible, you can. Especially over the next few podcasts, that's what we're going to be looking at is Revelation 17 and 18. So if you want to follow along. But verse 1, one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and spoke to me. This is John writing this. The angel said, come, I will show you the judgment on the great prostitute who is sitting on many waters. So as we go through this, what Peter and I are going to do is just kind of talk things out. We'll go back and kind of write notes down so we can hopefully include those in the book. And again, for our listeners, if you have ideas, comments on what we're saying, fill those in. You can help us co-author this book as well. So the background on this is one of the angels from the visions of the bowls in Revelation 16. He's introducing John to the next vision. So, and that's what the bowls are, that they are judgment that God is going to be bringing upon the world. And the angel says to John, come, I'll show you the judgment of the great prostitute. So, Peter, who is this prostitute?
Yeah, the prostitute who sits on many waters. Since she's sitting by these many waters, you might say that she sits on a throne of lies. Her power comes from the ability to deceive, just like the woman folly early in the book of Proverbs. She tricks people into believing her lies, and that's how they fall under the influence and power. As far as the identification, we're talking, you see some of the details that the kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality with her. So I think, I haven't looked at this in a while, but I think we're talking about the godless church, especially the church of the Antichrist, which we see a little bit later, the Babylon the Great, the mother of the prostitutes, and of the abominations of the earth. And then I saw that this woman was drunk from the blood of the saints and the blood of Jesus' martyrs. And so we've got this woman clothed in scarlet, and the kings of the earth want to use her and use her power in order to gain things for themselves. The one clothed in scarlet and purple, and yeah.
And so you've got this woman, this prostitute, and the way that Jesus, who is giving this vision to John, is demonstrating how the prostitute wants to look like the bride of Christ that we see in Revelation chapter 12. you and I, as a Christian church, we are the bride of Christ. Christ is the faithful bridegroom. Jeremiah 2 verse 2 says, "This is what the Lord says. This is what I remember concerning you, your faithfulness when you were young and your love when you were pledged in marriage." And when we look at the Old Testament, what we would call idolatry, because the Jewish people, they worshipped a lot of pagan religions. They followed along with the religions of the Canaanites and the Philistines and the Amorites, Ammonites, and so forth. That's why God said to Joshua, when you go into Canaan, you wipe out those peoples, because otherwise you're going to get sucked into those people's religions. They didn't, and they did. It didn't wipe them out, and they did get sucked into those false religions. And God doesn't so much call it idolatry, even though they worshipped idols. It was adultery. They were adulterating themselves with these false gods.
And then a little bit later in verse 9, when he gives some explanation, he says the 7 heads are 7 hills on which the woman is sitting, which is very clear.
Yeah, we're gonna get to each of these verses. We're gonna get into more in depth. I just want to kind of go through like verse by verse.
Excellent.
Peter likes to get the whole thing going. Yeah, I want to go in like verse by verse and kind of explain this. But you're right when you said the many waters, because it's going to get explained later on what that is there are many nations. This isn't just one religion in one place. This is all over the place, and it may seem like the false church greatly outnumbers those in Christ's little flock. Now, who have you heard is this prostitute, Peter? I mean, specifically
the Pope, the papacy.
Yeah.
I think that's the most common direct interpretation.
Right. I think if you're looking at Lutheran commentators, that's what they're going to say. One of the books I was looking at said, yeah, many Lutheran commentators understand this prostitute specifically to be the Roman papacy. And I was looking at, shoot, so you and I are going to be calling her not the papacy. That's one false religion, but just pagan religions. And then that commentary went on to say, but other commentators and the author of that book understand this vision to be all pagan religions. And that's the way you and I are taking it, right? Because every religion that is not centered on Christ is pulling people away from Christ. And then these are the pagan religions that I had messaged you probably 3 months ago, and I went back and looked at Messenger and then pulled them up. So I don't know if you want to speak to any of these, of where you see it in the Old Testament, and then also where you see it today, because we'll go more in depth with each of these. But the child sacrifice with Molech. Okay, where did you?
Yeah.
I think,
where
did you see it, and where do you see it now?
Yeah, child sacrifice, at least where do we see it now, maybe that's the easier part, is that every time that a people desert God and they turn toward a hypersexualized understanding of life, which is basically all the Canaanite religions, then you have to do something with the products of the children that result from that sort of union. And that child sacrifice, at least in the modern day, is exactly where we see abortion, as one example, held up as the tool for attaining what I want. That I'm not going to be held back by a child, or needing to stay at home with a child to raise a child. I get to pursue what I want, and all I have to do is sacrifice this child to my own wants, my own needs, my own preferences in life, and my own sense of freedom.
Yeah, and one of the examples I thought of would be, I remember a few years ago that there was an actress that was saying that because she had an abortion, that allowed her then to eventually win the Academy Award for whatever movie it was. Okay, so it's the same thing as the Jews, again, who got sucked into the pagan worship of Molech, of sacrificing their child to the god, and then the god, they believed, would give them something. And so that's what our culture is. If they give up their child, they can continue to do these abhorrent things. The next one would be Asherah, and then the abhorrent sex. And there, I figured we would talk about things like homosexuality, lesbianism, transgenderism. I read an article this morning. I didn't want to, but the headline was there because the one political party, along with the media, they want to normalize these things. And what it is these three dudes in Minnesota that are supposedly have a farm together, but these two guys are in a sexual relationship, and then the guy in the middle, he's in a sexual relationship with this third guy. But the third guy and the first guy, they're not really together. And they're trying to normalize these things. That's well, any of it's abhorrent, and then they just increase it and so forth. So,
yikes!
I know you don't want to talk about anything on that.
Yeah, I mean, when we get to when you're reading through Old Testament and it says, I'll just talk about Asherah poles, and we don't have imagery of that for our Sunday school, and even in regular like adult Bible class, we kind of glance over it, and the only footnote is symbols devoted to the goddess Asherah. That it's the sort of perversion that is completely obsessed with the sense of power, the sense of fulfillment, the sense of pursuit of what I want, that is embodied in our anatomical makeup. I have to find like a good way of talking about this so that I can talk about it without, because my mom listens to this podcast, and I don't want to say, "Don't worry, Mom, I'm writing the chapter on Asherah. Just give me a minute. Don't read that one. Skip over it."
That's like I remember watching Fletch with my parents one time, and I'd only seen the TV version of it, and then when you watch the real version, the unedited version, going, oh man, this is really uncomfortable to watch this with my parents. It's the same thing. Like I haven't gone to see the new Deadpool Wolverine movie, and I'm sure my youngest daughter Belle will go see it with her friends or her boyfriend, and I may see it, but I don't really want to see it with her because because of the language and so forth that's in there. It's uncomfortable to talk about those kinds of things. But there, as we're talking about this, thankfully I had one of the people who had found our book, and she had messaged me and then talked to me probably about half a year ago. And she is right in the thick of this kind of battle on abhorrent sex in her little town in Texas. She even shared some news articles with me about her being named in these news articles. She's trying to get these kind of books about gay sex and gay porn out of their library and schools. And in talking to her, I realized, okay, now I have the third part of each chapter, because the first part is going to be what is the tie with the Old Testament or New Testament pagan religions. Mm-hmm. Where do we see the tie, the neo-paganism that our government is funding right now? And then the third part is going to be, what do we do about it as Christians? And there I think of, we need to be like Gideon. We need to go in, and even if it's under the cover of darkness, and go and destroy the Asherah pole and realize, that we need to be able to say boldly, this is wrong. This is against God. The next one,
and I think together with that is that we see it with abortion, and we see it with the topic of pride, that they aren't telling the truth, and they know it. That abortion isn't about your freedom. Abortion, like the state of Minnesota abortion law that Governor Walz signed into law. And I've heard people say that Governor Walz is very much in favor of stopping and preventing child abuse, and he's an advocate for the overlooked children who are being abused. I'll admit that, But at the same time, I would assert that telling a woman she can carry her child to term and then just have the doctor slit its throat is not freedom, and that is the utmost of child abuse that you could ask for, because they're running like a misdirection campaign, and we're falling for it. That we fall for all the red herrings, all the glitz, the glitter, the glamour, the talking points that are projected at us, that it is about freedom, or it's only about love. Well, okay, maybe there is some sort of romantic love, but at the number one, the Bible doesn't condone that. And number two, if the point is that I ought to follow whatever urge that my heart wants, well, the heart is endlessly deceptive, and purposely deceptive in saying, well, here we have pride in what we do. That it's about love, and missing the point that there is a proper godly use of the body, and there is everything outside of marriage as God designed it is an improper and ungodly use of the body, and that it is a sin against one's own body. It's not outside your body, it is within and part and parcel of your body, and that is totally obfuscated and brushed over and blown aside, as if to say, well, that's not really the issue. And I say this and knowing that I also have to follow that up with, I have all sorts of compassion, and I'm not condoning any sort of violence at all. But I have compassion for somebody who is dealing with that, because I know that even if they happen to be in what is considered a good or loving relationship, that it's not going to end well.
Yeah, and you mentioned that word freedom. Again, if you're paying attention to the DNC, that is the word they're using right now, is freedom. And as if you're conservative, you like freedom. If you're a Christian, we're free in Christ. That's not how they're using it. It's a freedom for licentiousness. It is a freedom to let the sinful nature just do whatever it wants. And the next one would be Baal, and then that's the climate cult. That we'll be talking about the paganism of worshiping nature, Mother Earth, and so forth. And we see that all the time. Another one would be Satanism. And there are real life current examples of a statue to Satan being put up in the Iowa government. There was also another one in Michigan. You've got a statue that looks like a demon that was made for Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and so forth. So this neo-paganism, it's not hiding. It's right out there in the open.
And that at the same time, we see, like the image right behind you, the prostitute sitting on many waters, and that the core of it is to get Christians to be distracted from the gospel truth, and that Satan loves to use things that he knows will get people riled up. And Christians of all people, yes, we should feel very strongly about this, but we should also be people who are, like complete people and in charge of our own emotions to the degree, like, yeah, speak strongly about it, but don't let yourself get so riled up and worried about it that you're just swept along by an emotional argument and thinking that abortion or pride or transgenderism or you name it is the issue, because the issue is that is just there and to keep you distracted, to get you to grab hold of your emotions and think that you are fighting the battle by fighting against those things in particular, rather than seeing the demonic force behind it. I'm liking this book already.
Yeah, and the podcast I was listening to on the way over here today, it was Eastern Orthodox pastor, and he was interviewing an Eastern Orthodox priest, and they were talking about being spiritual but not religious. And what that phrase really comes down to is the fact that everyone is spiritual. And that's the purpose of this book, is that everyone is going to be looking for an answer. And you're exactly right, Peter, that when it comes to sex, and then the result of sex is going to be children, and then the climate cult or Satan, they're worshiping something. it all comes down to the sinful nature realizes we're not alone. We are beholden to someone or something, and they're looking for that someone or something in false gods. We have the true God, and so you're right. We got to sweep all of that away to get to the truth and give them the truth, who is Jesus Christ. And as we go through this, so it doesn't sound like a downer, because we're looking at a lot of really filthy stuff, is to see as we go through this Bible study, really these first two chapters of the book on Revelation 17 and 18 is really Christ is going to defeat these two beasts. That's the end of chapter 17. So Satanism. So I figured, Peter, Peter and I haven't talked about this because we haven't talked for 3 months really. I'll probably do the first couple. I actually know things about those. These next ones, because you're the smart guy, these are a little smarter.
Come on.
If you want nihilism, what is nihilism?
I usually pronounce it nihilism.
Oh yeah, that's better
when I'm discussing it with our 4-year-old.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, nihilism is basically.
You can correct my pronunciation too. It's just like Delphine or Dolphin Island. That's good.
Yeah,
nihilism.
Yeah, the idea that it's hopeless, that it doesn't matter, that it's all going to go to nothing anyway, that there's nothing after life. It's just depressing all around. That and that kind of results in very often the idea of Epicureanism.
That's one on here because you asked to add that
good.
one on, so that's one on here that you have to do.
Good, and toss Gnosticism in there as long as we're on it.
That one's the next one.
Yes,
and the other one is Scientism.
Scientism, yeah, and every time you've got an ism, that should be a big red flag that this is an issue, this is a problem. That study of science is good. Scientism is basically elevating something to the level of God, whether you're talking about transgenderism or Gnosticism, Epicureanism. It's a guiding ideology for life. Scientism is saying that we as humans have the ability and thus the also the responsibility to understand everything as well as we can, and then to protect our future through that knowledge. Gnosticism is the separation of body and soul, saying that you aren't one unit, one person, but that you are, the truth is really found in your spirit. I talked about that in a sermon a few weeks back. I don't know which one. You'd have to go back on the podcast and look it up. Just listen to all of them.
That's right.
Yeah, and what was the other one? I'm sorry, the one that I was going to be starting.
Nihilism, Gnosticism, Scientism, and Epicureanism.
Yeah. So nihilism is the idea that basically nothing matters, and so then it leads you to the question of, number one, is there such a thing as right and wrong? And number two, how can you discern what is true and real? And then number three, how do you get any joy? What should you seek from life? Any joy, any meaning, that sort of a thing. And then how do you define that? And so if you want a fantastic book like that, it's an easy read. It's not really a nihilism book. It's called The Stranger by Albert Camus, Camus, and it's a quick read. It's not really one that you read a lot of your children at bedtime, but on the surface it looks like a very basic storyline. But it includes, here's the hint, it includes an untrustworthy narrator who is only concerned about the moment right now.
Okay.
That's my book recommendation for today.
There you go. Yeah, and so that's what we're going to be working on over the next few months. I have no idea how long it's going to take us to write this book. Well,
I'm relieved because I thought I'd have to do all sorts of research on all these pagan cults and read up I'm logged into JSTOR right now to read academic articles on the Greek mysteries and the Canaanite cults, and I'm like, oh, I don't have to do that. This is fantastic.
You give me the information, and I'll do that because I get bored, so I have to keep busy. The other night, my wife came home she's a teacher's aide in a school in Milwaukee, and she came home. She was exhausted, and then I had her canning apple cider until 9:45 at night. And then, because we picked apples and pears this weekend, so now we have to can apples and pears. And then last night we did jalapenos. I like canning pickled peppers, and we have to do spaghetti sauce and so forth. So, because I can't just sit around and do nothing. So, well, let's write a book.
What should I
And
do? I'll write a book.
let's write a book. So lastly, I think we can wrap it up here. But again, we're talking about a lot of awful stuff. So I want to end with one key verse in Revelation 17, that even though we see these pagan religions of the ancient times, and we see them now, neo-paganism, and we see our government acting so much like this beast out of the sea that is partnering and promoting these pagan religions, and they're all working for the devil, still Jesus gives us this key verse, verse 14. They, being Babylon and the beast, will wage war against the Lamb, but the Lamb will overcome them, because he is Lord of lords and King of kings. Those who are with him are the called, the elect, and the believing. So we'll wrap it up there, and Lord willing, we'll see everyone next week.